Before the show, a backstage disaster unfolded. Dean Martin, known for his cool demeanor, was about to step on stage in a brand new tuxedo when everything went wrong. A backstage worker made a mistake that could have ruined the night. But what Dean did next shocked everyone in the room. Where are you watching from? It was 1949, and the Rio Bomba Club was buzzing with tension. The club was no ordinary venue. Mob bosses and Hollywood insiders filled the tables, and the air crackled with unspoken rules. Tonight was supposed to be a big night for Dean Martin, a star on the rise, trying to prove himself without his comedic partner Jerry Lewis. The venue was packed, and the pressure was palpable. This was more than a performance. It was an audition for bigger things. Moretti, the club's middle management enforcer, was in charge of making sure everything went off without a hitch. The slightest mistake, and someone would pay. It was a moment that would either launch Dean into the next stage of his career, or destroy him. The stakes had never been higher, and the room felt the weight of it. Moretti barked orders backstage, his voice filled with menace. He demanded perfection. No mistakes, no excuses. But little did anyone know, the real test was yet to come. A young waitress, Sarah, was about to find out just how far people would go to protect their reputations. The calm before the storm, however, was about to shatter in a split second. Sarah was only 22 years old, a single mother working double shifts at the Rio Bomba to support her daughter, Marie. Life hadn't been kind to her, but she kept going, driven by the hope of a better future. Her worn shoes, patched up with sharper marks, told the story of every sacrifice she had made. Despite the grueling hours, Sarah remained quiet, keeping her head down, smiling through the exhaustion. The clientele at the Rio Bomba was ruthless, often treating the staff like little more than furniture. The men, drunk on power and alcohol, would leer at her, making crude remarks. But she had learned long ago that surviving meant staying invisible, never stirring trouble. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, carefully avoiding the hands that reached out to grab her. The people around her didn't matter, only the tips did. A night like tonight, with a packed crowd and big names in attendance, meant that she might just have enough to feed Marie for another week. But that was before the incident, before everything went wrong. She was walking through the crowd when a drunk patron, Frankie Bones, grabbed her. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. It wasn't just a playful touch. It was a forceful grab that made her skin crawl. As Sarah struggled to free herself, the situation escalated. Frankie Bones, a regular at the club, wasn't known for his charm. He was known for his entitlement. He tugged at her, pulling her closer, his breath reeking of liquor as he slurred out crude remarks. "Hey, sweetheart, where's my smile? Don't be stuck up." He didn't care that she was busy, that she was holding a tray of drinks meant for important people, or that she had a job to do. His hands, rough and demanding, gripped her side like they owned her. She kept her composure, tried to smile, but the tightness in her chest was unbearable. "Please, sir," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to deliver this." But Frankie wasn't interested in her words. His eyes narrowed, and with a swift pull, he dragged her closer, causing the tray to tilt dangerously. Sarah's heartbeat quickened, panic beginning to claw at her as the coffee pot teetered on the edge. In that instant, everything seemed to move in slow motion. She tried to steady herself, but it was too late. The pot tilted too far, and before she could react, it splashed across the front of Dean Martin's immaculate tuxedo. The hot coffee spread instantly, staining the white shirt and dark jacket in a horrifying, boiling mess. The room froze. Dean stood there, just a few feet away. In the exact moment that his flawless appearance was shattered, Dean Martin wasn't just any entertainer. He wasn't the bumbling drunkard that the world saw on television. He was something far more dangerous, far more calculating. Tonight, he wasn't just there to perform. He was there to prove his worth. His tuxedo, crisp and flawless, was a symbol of everything he had worked for. He had come a long way from his humble beginnings, and now, here he was, about to take center stage in front of the very people who could make or break his career. But when the coffee hit him, everything changed. His pristine look was ruined in an instant. The crowd held its breath as Dean stood frozen for a split second. The room had witnessed countless celebrities lose their temper over far less, but Dean didn't even flinch. Instead, he slowly looked down at the stain spreading across his chest, his expression unreadable. The sound of sizzling coffee on his shirt filled the room, adding to the tension. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and all eyes were on him. What would Dean Martin, the king of cool, do now? Would he snap? Would he rage? Or would he do something nobody expected? And then, the truth began to unfold. Sarah stood there, frozen, watching in horror as the coffee slowly soaked into Dean's shirt. Her hands were burned from trying to catch the pot, the skin blistering under the searing heat. The room seemed to close in on her as her mind raced. She was so focused on Dean, on his ruined tuxedo, that she didn't even realize she had started to tremble. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the pain, but from the weight of the moment. She had ruined a celebrity's expensive outfit, and she knew what came next. Moretti, the club's manager, was already moving towards her, his face dark with rage. The other patrons, the ones who held the power in this room, were silent, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Frankie Bones, the man who had caused it all, sat back in his booth, completely indifferent, as if he hadn't just contributed to ruining someone's life. It wasn't about the coffee stain anymore. It was about Sarah's fate. Her job was over. She would be blamed, humiliated, and forced out without a second thought. But what happened next would defy every expectation. Dean Martin didn't shout. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he turned and slowly walked toward the center of the room, his gaze fixed on Moretti. Moretti was shaking with anger as he approached Sarah, his steps heavy and deliberate. He had built his entire life on intimidation, and he wasn't about to let a waitress ruin his carefully cultivated sense of control. "You stupid, clumsy cow," he spat, his voice cold and venomous. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've ruined a $500 tuxedo. $500. You'll never work in this town again. I'll make sure of it." Sarah couldn't even respond. The pain in her hands and the weight of the humiliation left her speechless. She knew what was coming. The threats, the insults, the total destruction of her reputation. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced with the bleak certainty of losing everything. But then something shifted. Dean Martin, the man who could have easily joined in on the scorn, remained calm, his expression unreadable. He stepped between Moretti and Sarah, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator assessing its prey. Moretti stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening slightly. Dean's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "Fired for what?" he asked, his tone deceptively lazy. "She just customized my outfit. I was getting bored of the black and white. The brown adds texture. Very European, very on guard." The room was stunned into silence. Dean had just turned the situation completely around. Moretti stood there, utterly dumbfounded. His mind raced, trying to process Dean's words, but nothing made sense. He had expected anger, frustration, maybe even an apology. But instead, Dean was making a joke out of the whole situation. Moretti's authority, his hold over the room, seemed to slip away in that moment. The man who had built his life on control and intimidation suddenly found himself powerless. He stammered, trying to salvage his position, but the words felt hollow. "Mr. Martin, Dean raised a single hand, a simple gesture, but one that froze Moretti in place. "You don't get it, do you, Moretti?" Dean's voice was quiet now, but it carried an edge. "Accidents happen. Coffee spills, trays drop. That's life. But screaming at a lady who's already hurt? That's a choice." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, now exhaled collectively, a mix of relief and disbelief. Dean Martin wasn't just confronting Moretti. He was flipping the power dynamic in front of everyone. He wasn't just standing up for Sarah. He was making a statement about how power worked in that room, and who truly held it. As Moretti stood there, his face flushed with confusion and fear, Dean didn't break eye contact. The room had gone from nervous tension to an electric silence, as everyone realized that they were witnessing a moment of pure control and dignity. Moretti, completely unnerved by Dean's calm authority, stuttered out an apology, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Dean's words had shattered the illusion of control that Moretti had spent years building. The room, once filled with hushed whispers and fearful anticipation, now seemed to shift in favor of the man who had turned a humiliating disaster into a demonstration of quiet strength. Moretti mumbled something about getting Dean changed, but it was clear that the power in the room no longer rested with him. Dean's gaze never wavered as he looked at Sarah, who was still standing there, her hands shaking, her tears still fresh. Without missing a beat, Dean gave her a reassuring smile, as if to tell her that everything would be okay. He didn't need to say a word. The gesture was enough. The room, once filled with fear and tension, now felt lighter, as if the air had shifted. Dean calmly removed his jacket, the coffee stain spreading across his chest, like an unintended badge. With his shirt sleeves rolled up and his tie loosely hanging around his neck, Dean walked onto the stage, like nothing had happened. But his smile, the one that made him a star, was different now. Slightly crooked, yet full of defiance. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he took the mic. New fashion from Paris, folks. It's called Café Odin. Very exclusive, very expensive. You can't buy it in stores. A poor kid just threw an entire pot of coffee on me backstage. And you know what? I think it's an improvement. The audience erupted in laughter, and in that moment, Dean Martin wasn't just performing. He was owning the moment. Dean's casual dismissal of the disaster left the crowd in awe. It wasn't just the humor. It was the way he had taken control of a situation that could have crushed anyone else. Most people would have fumed, demanded an apology, or walked off stage. But Dean Martin wasn't most people. He made the ruined tuxedo part of the act, making the audience laugh in the process. They weren't laughing at him. They were laughing with him. Dean had turned a humiliating mistake into a moment of triumph, proving to everyone in the room that he was untouchable. As he performed, the stain on his shirt became a symbol of his resilience. It wasn't just a coffee stain. It was a reminder that no matter how hard life tried to knock him down, he would always rise above. For Sarah, standing backstage and watching, it was a revelation. She had witnessed a kind of power she had never seen before. In that moment, she understood that strength wasn't about yelling or controlling others. It was about staying calm, maintaining dignity, and knowing when to stand up for what was right. Dean had taught her that power didn't come from titles or intimidation. It came from inside, from the ability to remain composed when everything around you was falling apart. It was a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. As the show went on, the atmosphere in the Rio Bamba Club shifted. What had started as a tense, volatile night now felt lighter, almost electric. Dean Martin's performance was nothing short of legendary. His confidence, his effortless charm, and his ability to turn the chaos into comedy left the audience completely captivated. But in the back of the room, Sarah's world had changed in ways she couldn't fully grasp yet. She watched as Dean moved with ease on stage, his humor and warmth enveloping the crowd. She realized that what had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, a career-ending mistake, had, in fact, led to something far greater. She had seen the truth behind the persona. Dean wasn't just a star. He was a man who understood the value of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Backstage, after the performance, Sarah found herself still holding on to the hope that she wouldn't be sent home, shamed and jobless. But something had shifted between her and Dean. It wasn't just about the money, or the job, or the ruined tuxedo anymore. It was about respect. When the night ended, Dean made sure to quietly slip her a $50 bill, pressed into her hand like a quiet act of defiance. "Get yourself something good for those hands, kid," he had said, and Sarah knew what he meant. He had seen her, truly seen her, in a way no one had before. The next morning, the Rio Bamba Club buzzed with whispers about the night before. The coffee stain that had ruined Dean's tuxedo had now become part of his legend. No one could stop talking about it. The way he had turned the whole situation into a joke, yet still made his point, was something the audience would never forget. But for Sarah, the night had taken on a different meaning. She had expected to be fired, humiliated, and sent away without a second thought. Instead, Dean's quiet act of defiance had given her something she hadn't known she needed: hope. The owner, Mr. Costello, had given her the week off, paid, to recover from her burns. It was a generous gesture, but it wasn't the money that mattered to Sarah. It was the fact that she wasn't being discarded, that she hadn't been erased like so many others. The $100 bonus she received was more than just a paycheck. It was a symbol of respect, something she had never been given in the industry. But there was something more, something that couldn't be bought or paid for with money. It was the understanding that, despite everything she had endured, she was worth something. She wasn't invisible anymore. And it was all because of Dean Martin. As the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. The burns on her hands healed, but the mark Dean had left on her, both in that moment and with his quiet act of kindness, remained. She went back to work at the Rio Bamba, but this time, things felt different. The other staff members, who had once kept their heads down out of fear, now seemed to notice her in a new light. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had been part of a moment that had shifted the power dynamics of the entire club. Frankie Bones, the man who had caused the whole incident, never came back. Sarah never saw him again, and though no one ever said it outright, she knew that Dean's actions had taken care of the problem. It wasn't just a performance on stage. Dean had used his power to quietly remove the people who didn't belong. Sarah didn't ask for any of this. She didn't want to be the center of attention. But Dean had shown her something far more important, the ability to stand tall in a world that often wanted to keep you down. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. And it was all because, in the midst of a disastrous night, Dean Martin had chosen to protect her in the weeks that followed. Dean's quiet intervention became the stuff of whispers among the staff at the Rio Bamba. No one spoke about it openly, but everyone knew that something had shifted. Moretti, once the terror of the club, now seemed like a man walking on thin ice. His harsh demeanor had softened, his authority undermined by a simple act of humanity that came from the unlikeliest of sources. The power had clearly shifted in the club, and Dean Martin was at the center of it all. But it wasn't just the staff who had noticed. The regulars, the ones who had once made the rules with their money and connections, had begun to watch Dean more closely, as if they too were trying to figure out what kind of man could destroy a bully with a few words and a look. Dean's reputation had grown, and with it, his control over the room. No longer was he just a funny drunk on TV. He was someone who commanded respect without ever having to raise his voice. And then, one day, Dean disappeared from the club. Not in the way that stars often vanish after a show. He simply stopped showing up. Word spread that he had moved on, leaving the club behind. There were rumors, of course. Some said he had found a better venue, others that he was focused on his burgeoning career outside of nightclubs. But no one really knew where he went. What they did know was that, in his absence, the club had changed. Moretti no longer ruled the roost with fear. The workers, like Sarah, had gained a new sense of agency. The balance of power had been irrevocably altered as Sarah stood in the club one final time, cleaning up after the night's performance. She reflected on how far she had come. The world around her had shifted in subtle ways, but the most important change was within herself. She was no longer the same woman who had walked into the Rio Bamba 8 months earlier. That woman, worn down by the weight of responsibility and the cruelty of the world around her, had been replaced by someone who had learned the power of standing up for herself. She had seen firsthand what could happen when you refused to be intimidated, when you refused to be treated like nothing. Dean had shown her that, and in doing so, he had given her a gift that would last far beyond that night. As she packed her things, preparing to leave the Rio Bamba for good, Sarah felt a sense of quiet pride. She wasn't leaving defeated. She wasn't leaving broken. She was leaving stronger than when she arrived. She had made it through, and in some ways, she had won. Sarah's story, like so many others in Hollywood's hidden past, was one of resilience, quiet courage, and the power of knowing when to fight back. The night Dean Martin had stood up for her was one she would carry with her always. It wasn't just about a ruined tuxedo. It was about dignity, respect, and the subtle ways in which power could be wielded without ever raising a hand. Years passed, but the story of that night at the Rio Bamba never really faded. For Sarah, it became part of her personal history, a quiet chapter in a life that had known far too much struggle. She moved on, eventually finding stability in a different life, a life where she didn't have to constantly fight for dignity, where she wasn't just surviving but thriving. But the lessons she'd learned from Dean, that night would stay with her forever. She passed it down to her daughter, Marie, who grew up knowing that strength didn't always come from loud voices or aggressive power plays. Sometimes the greatest strength came from quiet defiance, from standing tall in the face of adversity, and from knowing your worth even when others tried to diminish it. Meanwhile, the Rio Bamba Club faded into obscurity. The records of its existence, along with its dark history, were lost in a fire in 1967. Most people forgot about it, but those who had been there, who had witnessed what went down that night, carried the memory. They remembered Dean Martin not just as a star, but as a man who showed what it meant to use influence with grace, and how the real power didn't lie in being feared. It lay in being respected. And for those who had seen it, that night remained a quiet but pivotal turning point in their lives. Dean Martin's legacy continued to grow, but the truth of who he was, the man behind the act, remained a carefully guarded secret. Hollywood's sanitized version of Dean, the lovable goofball, was the one that lived on in public memory, while the sharp, calculating businessman who knew exactly how to navigate the complexities of power was quietly erased from the narrative. The public wanted to believe in the myth of the cool guy who stumbled into success without a care in the world. What they didn't want to acknowledge was that Dean Martin, the man who had appeared to be drunk and carefree, was often the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. The version of Dean that people saw on screen was a carefully crafted persona, a mask that hid a man who understood the nuances of influence and respect better than anyone else in the room. And that's why the story of what happened at the Rio Bamba Club was buried. It didn't fit the narrative. It didn't align with the Hollywood myth. But for those who had witnessed it, for those who had seen Dean's quiet courage that night, his legend grew not just because of his charm, but because he had shown them all that true power wasn't about dominating others. It was about standing firm in your own strength and letting your actions speak louder than any words. As time went on, Sarah's life settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time, like peace. She found love in a jazz musician who understood the quiet strength that had been ignited in her that night. They married, and eventually, Sarah had another daughter, whom she named Deanna. Dean's influence still lingered in her mind. The $50 he had slipped into her hand that night had never been spent. She had kept it tucked away, a symbol of how much a single act of kindness could change the course of someone's life. It was more than money. It was a lesson in dignity, in fighting back without raising your fists, and in standing tall even when the world seemed ready to knock you down. Every time Sarah looked at her daughters, she thought of Dean. She thought of the way he had defended her without a single word of anger, how he had used his power to protect her when she was the most vulnerable. It wasn't just his actions that had made a difference. It was his willingness to use his position to stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself. That night at the Rio Bamba, Dean Martin had given Sarah a future, and in return, she gave that future to her daughters, making sure they knew their worth in a world that often tried to tell them otherwise. Years later, Sarah found herself sitting at the kitchen table, reflecting on everything that had happened. Her life had turned out better than she ever expected, but there were still days when she felt the weight of the past. On those days, she thought of Dean. She thought of the way he had quietly changed her life with a single act of kindness. She thought of how his support had restored her belief in herself, and how she had passed that belief down to her children. And as she looked at her daughters, she realized something important. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living with dignity, with courage, and with the knowledge that even when the world tried to break you, there were always ways to rise above it. Sarah never forgot Dean's quiet power. She never forgot the way he had stepped in when it mattered most. That story, the one the networks didn't want anyone to hear, became a part of her own story. She passed it on, not because it was a story of fame or fortune, but because it was a story of true humanity, the kind of humanity that Hollywood so often tries to bury. And in her heart, she knew that Dean Martin had taught her the most valuable lesson of all, that the quietest, most strategic moves are often the ones that have the most lasting impact. The years went by, but Sarah's story never really left the club's history. In fact, it became part of the folklore, whispered among the few who still remembered the Rio Bamba and its forgotten glory. The story of Dean Martin's calm intervention, the ruined Tuxedo, and the waitress he saved was told and retold in the quiet corners of the city. The people who had been there that night, the ones who had witnessed the raw power of Dean's reaction, kept the memory alive. But it wasn't just a story about an entertainer. It was a story about standing up for what was right, about using one's position to protect those who were vulnerable, and about the quiet power that often goes unnoticed. For the others in the room that night, it was a moment that had left an indelible mark. The story of Sarah and Dean, while never recorded in the official history of Hollywood, lived on in the hearts of those who had seen it. For Sarah, it was more than just a night in her life. It was a reminder of the dignity she had reclaimed, of how one act of kindness could shift the course of a person's future. And as she passed the story down to her own children, she knew that it wasn't just about Dean's legacy. It was about what that night had given her, the strength to face the world with her head held high, no matter the cost. And so, the legend of Dean Martin, the one that was shaped by the public's perception of him as the carefree, charming entertainer, remained intact. The Hollywood version of Dean, the one who made people laugh with his drunken antics, continued to be the story told in biographies and documentaries. But those who had been there that night knew the truth. They knew that behind the facade, Dean Martin was a man who understood how to navigate the world with a quiet, unshakable power. A man who, when faced with a ruined tuxedo and a broken woman, chose to protect and defend. And that was the true legacy of Dean Martin. Not the persona of the lovable drunk, but the calm, calculated man who knew how to use his influence to change lives. Sarah, now long removed from the Rio Bamba and the pain of her past, continued to live with the quiet dignity Dean had inspired in her. She had learned the greatest lesson of all. Real power wasn't about how loud you could shout or how much you could intimidate others. It was about using your position to help those who couldn't help themselves. The story of that night may have been buried by the industry, but it would never be forgotten by those who had lived it. It was a hidden truth, a story of quiet strength and enduring humanity, and one that, in the end, was more powerful than any glittering Hollywood facade. Dean Martin's legacy wasn't built on his humor or his fame. It was built on quiet acts of strength, the kind that go unnoticed by the world. But for those who saw what he did that night, it was a reminder that true power comes not from domination, but from protecting others when they can't protect themselves. If you've ever witnessed a quiet act of courage, share it with us in the comments below. What's the quietest, most powerful thing you've ever seen someone do? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from the Golden Age.